This special episode is different from my normal episodes. My mom passed away last year in August from stage 4 breast cancer, and I wanted to honor her today on what would have been her 76th birthday. This is a very difficult episode to make since it's the first time without having her on her birthday, so please bear with me through this process. My mom was a very religious woman for most of her life, and she spent most of her time focusing on God and showing compassion for others. We loved each other, but we had our disagreements due to different outlooks in life. This episode I'm dedicating to her will have stories about angelic encounters and near-death spiritual experiences. I'm so grateful to get my creativity and writing skills from her. She wrote many stories and had a true passion for it. If you don't think this episode is something you would be interested in, please feel free to skip it. First, I want to start out by quoting my mom's favorite Bible verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. John 3:16. Now let's get into the stories. In April 2015, Pastor John Boston was a young husband and father who recently accepted a position with Central Seventh-day Adventist Church and moved to Columbus, Ohio with his wife Carla and their 4-year-old daughter Riley. He was driving on Airport Road when another car crossed the center line and came barreling toward him. Pastor John swerved to miss the vehicle and struck a utility pole. A live transformer came down on his car. Immediately, the metal and glass began to buckle due to the intense heat from thousands of volts of electricity. The windshield was melting and the passenger window was folding into the car. He was trapped inside the burning car where the seatbelt was stuck and the door wouldn't open. That's when Pastor John said a scruffy-looking stranger came out of nowhere and easily opened the smashed door. The man removed him from the car and walked him 20 yards from the vehicle to safety, just before it exploded in flames. The man said, "My name is Johnny. The police are almost here, and I can't be here when they get here, but you're going to be okay." And then the man was gone. First responders arrived and rushed Pastor John to the hospital. He was treated for what turned out to be only minor injuries and was questioned about the mysterious man. He said people tried to rationalize the situation and thought maybe the circuit breaker tripped and Johnny fled because of a sketchy past. However, even firefighters said that there are some aspects of what happened that defy logic, reason, and science. Veteran Columbus firefighters said no one should have been able to touch or walk away from a car with a live transformer on top of it. The circuit breakers could have tripped, but they're designed to immediately reset themselves, and electricity was still coursing through the car when help arrived on scene. Additionally, officials with the power company said the area never lost electricity. With a transformer on the car, that's probably one of the worst runs we could roll upon, one firefighter said. Firefighters say rescuing someone from a scenario in which there is a live transformer on a vehicle is extremely complicated. The person that touches the car is the ground. You have to jump away from the vehicle and shuffle your feet, but even that's risky, one firefighter said. But yet, in Pastor John's case, both he and Johnny weren't badly hurt. Another firefighter said it gave him goosebumps. As for Pastor John, he's convinced his rescuer was an angel. No one should have been able to touch the car. I shouldn't have survived, he said. He decided to share his story publicly in hopes of inspiring others who may have lost faith. He said the experience had dramatically changed his life. He is more determined to serve his city and help as many people as possible. After months of physical therapy, he and his congregation have increased efforts to feed the hungry, and they organized a large mission trip to Haiti in 2016. Pastor John said, "I don't think angels come to us with wings and white robes shining lights. I think they come as help, and that's what I had that day." In 1998, Luke was diagnosed with bone cancer at 8 years old. He came down with an infection and had to go to the hospital. He was there for about 2 weeks when one evening, Luke's mother was sitting at his bedside quietly praying as he slept. A nurse came into the room to check Luke's temperature, but his mother noted something rather peculiar about her. The nurse was wearing an old-fashioned uniform of the type that would have been common 30 years earlier, in the 1960s. The nurse noticed that Luke's mom had a Bible by the side of his bed. She said that she was a Christian too, and she would pray for Luke's healing. Luke's family had never seen this odd nurse before, and they never saw her again in Luke's remaining time at the hospital. Luke, who was 19 years old and completely cancer-free when he told his story, said, "I came out of the hospital fully healed of my infection. My mom believes this nurse could have been a guardian angel coming down to give her some hope. If she wasn't an angel, why would she be wearing 1960s old-fashioned nurse clothing?" Back in 1980, Deb was a single mother with a 2-year-old and an infant living in San Bernardino County, California. Her parents lived about 30 miles away in Alta Loma. Deb would usually drop off the children at her parents' house, work or run errands, and then pick them up in the evening. One night, around 11:30, she picked up her children from her parents' place and headed home. Deb's car had a broken gas gauge, so she never knew how much gas she had. Halfway home, the car started to putter, and Deb realized it was on empty. She exited the first off-ramp that happened to be one slightly uphill. Almost at the top of the exit, her car died, and there was nothing around except empty fields and distant lights at a truck stop about a quarter of a mile down the road. With no car in sight, Deb didn't know what to do. Her young children were asleep, and trying to walk while carrying both of them in the middle of the night was not a good option. She could not call for help since it was before cell phones and felt helpless in the situation. "I put my head on the steering wheel while saying a short and panicky prayer," she said. "I haven't even finished when I heard a few taps on my window. When she looked up, she saw a clean-cut young man standing there who looked around 21 years old. He motioned for her to roll down her window. I remember I was surprised, but I wasn't even the slightest bit afraid, even though I normally would have been terrified," Deb said. The young man was dressed well and had a faint smell of soap. He didn't ask if she needed help. Instead, he told her to put the car in neutral and he would help her get over the last small hill towards a place where she could get gas. I thanked him and followed his instructions. The car started moving. I steered it toward the lights of the truck stop and turned around to yell thank you again to him. He was so nice. My car kept moving, but the young man was nowhere in sight. This area was completely remote. There is absolutely nowhere he could have gone that quickly, even if there is somewhere to go. I don't even know where he came from to begin with. Deb's car continued to roll down the hill until it reached the truck stop. She was able to get the gas she needed, and the kids remained sound asleep. I've always trusted God to take care of us, but in retelling that story many times to my children, who are now 30 and 32, they know for a fact that angels do exist and are sent to us if we just believe. I always thought it was so amazing that we were sent someone who I would trust instinctively without question. Since that incident, I've come to believe that we probably encounter angels all the time and take for granted who they really are. I think they come in all shapes and sizes, young and old, and sometimes when we least expect them. Laura entered the hospital in 1994 with acute pain from a fibroid tumor the size of a grapefruit in her uterus. The surgery was successful, but more complicated than expected. Laura recalled that she was in horrible pain. She had an allergic reaction to the morphine she was given, and the doctors tried to counteract it with other medications. This made a bad experience even worse. She just had major surgery, and now she was dealing with the pain of an acute drug reaction. After receiving more pain medication, she was able to sleep for a few hours. I awoke in the middle of the night. According to the wall clock, it was 2:45. I heard someone speaking and realized someone was at my bedside, she said. It was a young woman with short brown hair and wearing a white hospital staff uniform. She was sitting and reading aloud from the Bible. I asked her, "Am I all right? Why are you here with me?" The woman visiting Laura stopped reading but did not look up. She simply said, "I was sent here to make sure you be all right. You are going to be fine. Now you should get some rest and go back to sleep." She began to read again, and I drifted back off to sleep. The next morning, she explained the experience to her doctor, who checked and said that no staff had visited her overnight. She asked all of the nurses, and no one knew of this visitor. To this day, I believe I was visited by my guardian angel that night. She was sent to comfort me and to reassure me that I would be okay. Coincidentally, the time on the clock that night, 2:45 a.m., is the exact recorded time on my birth certificate of when I was born. Cold, pain, and fear. That's what Humberto Casas felt when his chest started hurting during a bike ride last winter. The only thing he could do as he waited for the ambulance was to pray. When I started praying, all this fear and the cold and the pain in my arms, it went away, and I experienced peace, he said. He was rushed to St. Catherine's Hospital in Wisconsin, where cardiologist Dr. Mike Rosenberg met him for the first time on the operating table. Humberto asked Dr. Rosenberg, "Is this a life or death situation?" The doctor looked at him and answered, yes it is." Humberto felt at that point his life was ending. Dr. Rosenberg confirmed that he had the Widowmaker Legion. He suffered 2 cardiac arrests. His heart stopped. What happened next was Humberto's incredible experience of dying and entering paradise, the path that leads you to heaven. Humberto also remembers the unimaginable feeling of peace, rest, and relief that washed over him, like the feeling you get after a long, long day of work, but 1,000 times more wonderful. "It's a beautiful feeling," he said. "Your soul just lets go. Your soul keeps following the light of God. That's where you feel life starts." While Humberto was on his heavenly journey, he remembers looking down and seeing his children on the couch. His wife then talks about how, after his recovery, he told the story to his children and they started crying and saying, "Dad, that's where we were sitting the whole time, praying." Humberto discounts the idea that some may have that he was only dreaming or hallucinating, because he says the experience is engraved in my soul. Dr. Rosenberg confirmed that other patients have described to him their near-death experience. Humberto has a joyful and hopeful message for all those mourning the death of a loved one. They don't need to worry. They're in a very good place. God is there. My husband, John Myers, tells people he died on January 11th. In reality, he did. He had been hospitalized for a day because of shortness of breath, and at about noon on January 11th, his heart stopped. By the time I walked into the ICU an hour later, after a perilous back road drive on a winter day, the medical team was still working on him. He had gone into something called cardiogenic shock, said the doctor who ushered me out into a hallway, away from the room where all the activity was happening. His heart stopped. His blood pressure was 0. He had said on his initial hospital paperwork that he didn't want CPR, so they were trying to bring his blood pressure up chemically. There were signs organs were shutting down. At some point I asked, "What does his life look like if he survives this?" She said she didn't expect him to live through the night. I would learn later that night that there was more happening in that hospital room than this team of doctors and nurses and other specialists working to get a guy's heart pumping again, because God was in the thick of it all. Much later that night, when John was stabilized and quasi-coherent, after a handful of friends who came to say goodbye to him had left, he said, "I think I had a near-death experience." I think I said, "No doubt." He said, "No, really." And I answered with probably more snark than was appropriate. "What, did you see the white light?" He had. And in the hours and days that followed, his memory became more solid. His story became a story of new life, grace, and peace. Here is how he described it. When his heart crisis began, he felt an intense pain. The monitors around him started to alarm, and the medical people came running. He said it was like watching a TV show or a movie. He described it as looking into a mirror dimly. They were all wearing blue scrubs, and he could see the sea of blue surrounding him. Suddenly, the blue morphed into a vibrant color, and then, quickly, a brilliant, bright white light surrounded the blue. He called it the most brilliant white light he had ever seen. He said it was so bright it was almost hard to look at. He was sure that God was in the room in that moment. He said it was the most incredible grace and love he had ever felt. Later, he said he's come to believe that the white light was not drawing him to it. The white light, he said, was lifting up the work of those who were saving him. He said he feels like he got a glimpse of what happens next. And even though he said he didn't feel like he had adequate words to describe it, he said it was a beauty and light beyond our knowing, that is, more than we can ever imagine. John was hospitalized for 15 days. It turns out an infection in his toe is what pushed his heart into crisis. He came home from the hospital with only 9 toes and a new outlook in life. It is the view of someone who has been resurrected, who is experiencing the promises of God now, in this life. A week after his hospital discharge, we attended the funeral of a young Lutheran pastor who died in his 30s of heart failure while waiting for a heart transplant that would never come. Our friend Ben was our touchstone. He knew all about heart issues and could explain things to us. It was quite something at that funeral for John, with his 9 toes, to be able to walk forward and receive communion from the Lutheran bishop who had, on January 11th, been one of the clergy to surround John's hospital bed, anoint him, and commend him to God. A couple of weeks after that, John came home from his church's Ash Wednesday service and said it was emotional for him to hear the words, "You are from dust, and to dust you shall return." He knows how close he came to dust. Today, when Christians around the world are celebrating the resurrection of our Lord and Easter, we are celebrating not just the promise of eternal life, but the promise of life now, before our hearts finally stop and we return to dust. In our house, we are celebrating the gift of time, however long or short. As we have shared John's experience, we are celebrating those who have told us of their similar experiences in seeing the light and living to tell about it. We are celebrating the humor in life, like the gift of a 9-toed skeleton that a parishioner gave to John while inducting him into the club of people who can no longer count to 20 on their digits. We are celebrating that miracles can happen, but that we can also live in the promise of the resurrection from this life to the next. January 11th was not John's night to depart in peace, and we do not know the day or time when our lives return to dust, but we live in hope, the promise of Easter. Randy Schaefer remembers being woken up by his mother's screams at 4 a.m. He was 16 years old at the time. It was 1969, and his family was staying at a hotel while on vacation in New Jersey. He ran towards the screams and found his father having a heart attack. He had some CPR training, so he began some mouth-to-mouth resuscitations, but it wasn't working. He ran out into the hallway, pounding on doors, trying to get someone to come out and help, but nobody did. Randy's father died that night. He was devastated. What's worse is that every time he thought about his father, he would be consumed with the feelings of guilt and fear. He thought about him on the hotel floor, and then he thought about his own eventual death. I would go into panic attacks, Randy said. I'd get real tight in my chest, and the only way I could control it is to try to settle myself down and say, okay, get it out of your head, get it out of your head. For Randy, death was a black wall, a question mark. That is, until he faced it. In March 2020, Randy had what he felt was a very persistent flu. His doctors had told him he just needed to rest, but as the days went on, his symptoms grew worse. He tested for COVID-19 and was positive. Things deteriorated fast for Randy. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he was put into a medically induced coma and placed on a heart-lung machine. He was unconscious for nearly a month, but he came through after a convalescent plasma treatment that his daughter Lisa pushed for. He received the blood transfusion on a Friday, and by Sunday, the doctors were able to turn off the heart-lung machine that had been keeping him alive. Randy said, "My lungs had completely cleared by that Tuesday. My kidneys started to function fully again, and so did my liver." After the medication wore off, Randy was steadily improving. His daughter was permitted to keep him company in his hospital room. Only after I was allowed at his bedside did he start communicating with me about what he experienced, she said. Randy said there was a moment while he was in a coma when he remembered his consciousness awaking. He was traveling through a kind of tunnel with a light streaming through like windows in an airplane. Beautiful, warm, loving light, he said. The tunnel brought him to a large room with arched windows and stained glass. It was also permeating with that same warm, loving light. Then a gentleman approached him and said he didn't belong there, that he had to leave. He walked out through giant oak doors into an even more serene scene. I remember going through the doors, and it took me out into a golden city. It was absolutely stunning. When he first described the city to his daughter Lisa, he said it was like Paris, but more beautiful, more pristine. He said the grass in the parks was a deeper green than anything on earth. And I've been to the Highlands of Scotland, he said. But this awestruck stroll took a turn when Randy realized he didn't know where he was or how to get back. He felt lost. I remember sitting down and I started to panic and I started to cry. That feeling of warmth had left him. He said he felt cold and scared. Suddenly, I looked over my shoulder and saw this big white staircase that rose up into the sky as far as you could see, he said. He began climbing the staircase, crawling on his hands and knees, and then he said someone called him by name, grabbed him by the shirt, and whisked him away. I remember it going black, back into my little dark sedated world. Lisa listened to her father's story intently, but let him know he hadn't traveled to any cities lately. In fact, he had been in a coma in the hospital room for nearly a month, but he insisted the experience was real. When she offered up that it was probably a dream or hallucination from the heavy medication, that didn't sit right with Randy. My dreams were foggy, and my hallucinations were just stupid. I saw 9 dancing panda bears on the ceiling, Randy said. But this was so real. I was there. I was involved with my environment, and I felt so much peace and love and acceptance, more than I have ever felt before. Lisa started noticing differences in her dad almost immediately after he got home. Like when he started opening up about the night his father died from a heart attack. My mom and I just sat at the kitchen island as he spoke, she said. He was telling us about it. As he was talking about the night in New Jersey, he asked his daughter to get an eyeglass case from the closet. He took the glasses out and stared at them. He looked a little stunned as he told her that the last person to take them out of the case was his father. My dad was 16 when his father died. He's almost 70 now. That tells you how long those glasses have just been sitting in their case. This wasn't like Randy. He wasn't one to divulge emotional details, especially when it involved the death of loved ones. Pre-COVID, Dad never talked about death. We didn't talk about dying. We didn't talk about God. We didn't talk about the afterlife. We didn't talk about any of that, Lisa said. It was moments like this that caused her to think differently about what her dad had shared in the hospital. She began seeing his near-death experience as what it was for him, something real. Along with a willingness to discuss death freely, he was open to talking about all sorts of questions. He started to dig deeper into his family's Christian faith and began praying regularly. As a result, he said he became a better version of himself. I'm much more open, much more welcoming, much more understanding than I was before. I think much more loving as a husband and father than I was before, he said. Before his brush with death, Lisa said her dad seemed a little lost, just going through the motions. But now he has newfound energy. He's excited and optimistic, and he loves sharing his near-death experience with anyone who is curious. He loves talking about it, which is good for him. I'm glad he has a hobby, she laughed. For Randy, his explanation is simple. He's no longer afraid to talk about death because he's no longer afraid of death. The panic attacks that used to plague him have stopped. If you ask Randy why he's no longer afraid of death, he puts it this way. I've been there. I've been there. I've experienced it. Not all near-death experiences feel loving, warm, and inviting. Here are a few unsettling experiences other people had. A man thrown from his horse found himself floating at treetop height, watching emergency medical technicians work over his body. No, this isn't right, he screamed. Put me back. But they did not hear him. Next, he was shooting through the darkness towards a bright light, flashing past shadowy people who seemed to be deceased family members waiting. He was panic-stricken by the bizarre scenario and his inability to affect what was happening. A woman in childbirth felt her spirit separate from her body and fly into space at tremendous speeds, then saw a small ball of light rushing towards her. It became bigger and bigger as it came toward me. I realized that we were on a collision course, and it terrified me. I saw the blinding white light come right to me and engulf me. A woman collapsed from hypothermia and began re-experiencing her entire life. I was filled with such sadness and experienced a great deal of depression. A woman in childbirth found herself abruptly flying over the hospital into a deep, empty space. A group of circular entities informed her she never existed, that she had been allowed to imagine her life, but it was a joke. She was not real. She argued with facts about her life and descriptions of Earth. No, they said, none of that has ever been real. This is all there was. She was left alone in space. Another woman in childbirth felt herself floating on water, but at a certain point, it was no longer a peaceful feeling. It had become pure hell. I had become a light out in the heavens, and I was screaming, but no sound was going forth. It was worse than any nightmare. I was spinning around, and I realized that this was eternity. This was what forever was going to be. I felt the loneliness, the emptiness of space, the vast of the universe, except for me, a mere ball of light, screaming. A woman who attempted to end things felt herself sucked into a void. I was being drawn into this dark abyss, or tunnel, or void. I was not aware of my body as I know it. I was terrified. I felt terror. I'd expected nothingness. I expected the big sleep. I expected oblivion, and I found now that I was going to another plane, and it frightened me. I wanted nothingness, but this force was pulling me somewhere I didn't want to go. I never got beyond the fog. A man who was attacked by a hitchhiker felt himself rise out of his body. I was suddenly surrounded by total blackness, floating in nothing but black space, with no up, no down, left, or right. What seemed like an eternity went by. I fully lived in this misery. I was only allowed to think and reflect. A man in heart failure felt himself falling into the depths of the earth. At the bottom was a set of high, rusty gates, which he perceived as the gates of hell. Panic-stricken, he managed to scramble back up to daylight. A woman was being escorted through a frighteningly desolate landscape, and she saw a group of wandering spirits. They looked lost and in pain, but her guide indicated that she was not allowed to help them. An atheistic university professor with an intestinal rupture experienced being maliciously pinched, then torn apart by malevolent beings. A woman who hemorrhaged from a ruptured fallopian tube reported horrific beings with great appendages gasping and clawing at me. The sounds of their guttural moaning and the indescribable stench still remains 41 years later. There is no benign being of light, no life video, nothing beautiful or pleasant. A woman who attempted to end things felt her body sliding downward to a cold, dark, watery environment. When I reached the bottom, it resembled the entrance to a cave with what looked like web hangings. I heard cries, wails, moans, and the gnashing of teeth. I saw these beings that resembled humans with the shape of a head and body, but they were ugly and grotesque. They were frightening and sounded like they were tormented in agony. The terrifying new death experience is interpreted as a warning about unwise or wrong behaviors and to turn one's life around. I was being shown I had to shape up or ship out, one or the other. In other words, get your act together, and I did just that. Movements towards a dogmatic religious community is common in this group. Clinical social worker Kimberly Clark Sharp observed all the people I know who have had negative experiences became Bible-based Christians. They might express it in various sects, but they all feel that they have come back from an awful situation and have a second chance. Fear remains a powerful influence, but a strict theology may offer a way out. The atheistic professor who experienced being maliciously pinched and torn apart by maleficent beings left his university and attended seminary. Others also reported newfound devotion. I've stopped drugs, moved back to Florida, and now I'm in Bible college. I used to have a casual attitude towards death, but now I actually fear it more. So yes, this was a warning. I was permitted another chance to change my behavior on earth. I've taken my fear of death and given it to the scriptures. Since then, I dedicated my life to the Most High God and spent 60 hours a month speaking and teaching about the Creator of heaven and earth and all living creatures. I am not worried now about when I die because I know that God had promised us something far more. A woman whose anaphylactic reaction participated in a near-death experience with both loving and frightening elements concluded there are actually rational explanations for what I experienced. The brain under stress releases natural opiates that stop pain and fear. Lack of oxygen disrupts the normal activity of the visual cortex. Too much neural activity in the dying brain causes stripes of activity. Our eyes, even closed, interprets those stripes of activity as the sensation of moving forward in a tunnel. There are more brain cells concentrated in the middle of the cortex than on the edges, so as we get closer to death, the brain interprets all those dense cells with their crazy activity as a bright light in the middle of our visual field. It's all very scientific. A woman who had a terrifying experience during childbirth likely dismissed the reality of the experience. Perhaps it was the effects of the ether and not a near-death experience. A woman attacked by a lion dismissed the memory of her near-death experience as hallucinatory. I often wonder if, in the shock of the attack, my mind played tricks on me and that I may have just been unconscious and my brain deprived of oxygen. A man who for many years had spoken publicly about his radiant near-death experience had a second experience in which he felt attacked by gigantic, sinister, threatening geometric forms, leaving him with a deep-seated pessimism and terror of dying. Learning that drug-induced hallucinations include geometric forms, he concluded that his second near-death experience was only a drug reaction. This may have been an appropriate conclusion clinically, but the experience remains. Other experiencers have difficulty comprehending or integrating terrifying near-death experiences. These people, years later, still struggle with the implications of the near-death experience. I had an experience which had remained with me for 29 years. It had left a horror in my mind, and I have never spoken about it until now. And after all these years, the nightmare remains vivid in my mind. For some reason, 31 years later, all the memories are back and vivid. It's like reliving it all over again, and I don't want to. I thought I had it all resolved and in its place, but I'm having a really bad time trying to put it away this time. Also, for the next 50 years, I would try to repress the memory of the black, threatening experience. Because it felt so real, it continued to be frightening, no matter how old I got. And I've been married for 33 years, and I do not even discuss this experience with my husband. Yet, it is as clear to me today as it was when it happened. Additionally, I just buried the whole thing as deep as possible, got very busy in civic affairs and politics. It seems pretty clear to me now, though the specifics aren't in place, that there's some core issue that still needs dealing with. I see this vision as a flashback constantly. I cannot get it out of my head. I still see it in my mind from my own eyes. It has been 2 years and I've never talked about it. My husband does not even know. I want to put this behind me, but am unable. Some people experience the absence of a religious element in their near-death experience. I was filled with a sense of absolute terror and of being past the help of anyone, even God. I looked around me, consciously searching for God or some other angelic creature, but I found none. I expected the Lord to be there, but He wasn't. I called on God and He wasn't there. That's what scared me. The man attacked by a hitchhiker still struggled with the aftermath. I pondered if I was in that hell, will I go back upon my death? Was I sent there for something perhaps I'll do in the future, or something I did in the past? I don't believe in hell, but it was such a strong experience. There is always that underlying uncertainty and trouble and fear. On a personal note, my mom had a near-death experience when her appendix burst in her 20s. She told me how when she was in the hospital, she had a vision of angels and demons fighting over her soul. She was convinced that if she would have died, she would have gone to hell. That was the turning point in her life where she became more religious by going to church regularly and reading the Bible daily. She had maintained those habits throughout her life. To close out this tribute, I want to read a poem my mom wrote when she was 16 years old called Spring Leaves. O flower with your petals so bright, see no more you will tonight, for it was willed for you to leave, and no more shall we see of thee. But come next year, we'll find you there, blooming in the springtime air, your color new and brighter yet, for all to see and not forget. Happy birthday, Mom. I love you. Thank you, friends, for joining me today. If you enjoyed the stories on this episode, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be alerted to all future content. If you have a story you would like me to read, feel free to email me your submission for a chance to hear your story on a future episode. If you would like to support this channel, please join for bonus and members-only content. Thank you again, friends, for your love and support. I'm Avarea, and until next time, take care.